I would ask the group to come to order, and would like to welcome you both to Catholic University and the Life Cycle Institute. My name is Leslie Mentler. I teach history at Catholic and also direct the Center for American Catholic Studies, which is sponsoring today's symposium. As you almost certainly know, our featured speaker this afternoon is E.J. Dionne, well known, I would guess, to everyone here, both as a syndicated columnist and a media commentator. He's also a prolific author whose books include such titles as Why Americans Hate Politics, They Only Look Dead, Why Progressives Will Dominate the Next Political Era, you tell me that's true, and Stand Up, Fight Back, Republican Toughs, Democratic Wimps, and the Politics of Revenge. That book, by the way, will be on sale after the talk. And I hope that Mr. Dionne, despite an injury to his foot today, which is really quite severe, might be willing to sign copies. E.J. Dionne has also edited, is this thing on? Yes. It is, okay, thank you. Numerous volumes, including most recently, What's God Got to Do with the American Experiment? The last election suggests quite a lot, actually. And One Electorate Under God, a dialogue on religion and American politics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. Dionne to the Catholic University campus.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm hobbling and slow today. I thought of various explanations. Karl Rove sent some guys to break my legs and failed, or I kicked in the TV after I called Ohio. The matter is more mundane and more klutzy. I spilled a vat of boiling pasta on my foot, and I was when I hobbled into class. I teach at Georgetown, and my students were curious about what happened. I told them there's a moral here that was taught to me by my 9-year-old daughter, which is after I was writhing in pain. My wife had cooked some perfectly good chicken that night, but I felt like having pasta. And my daughter looked at me and said, "Dad, you should have had Mommy's pasta." So all of you should know from now on that when in doubt, have Mommy's or your spouse chicken. You should have had Mommy's chicken. So always have Mommy's or your spouse's chicken, and don't try to boil your own pasta. I am so grateful to be here, and I'm especially grateful to be with John and Leo, and if that was a plea for kindness from me, if that's what it looked like, compassion, it was. John and Leo are two of my favorite people and favorite sort of historians of political science. John, bless him, is married to a lovely woman from my hometown of Fall River, Massachusetts, and he's one of a handful of people I know in Washington who are intimately familiar with my hometown. He's also, as all of you know, written some great books on values and politics. I think John will have a land office business after this election. You know, some people believe that the Bush people arranged to steal this election. Actually, it was John who arranged the outcome just the way it was, stacked the exit polls to make sure that all these values issues got rated very high, and it's very good for him. And Leo Rebuffo is not only a brilliant historian, and I really commend his work to you, particularly, by the way, a book which I hope is still in print called The Old Christian Right, which I actually think reads better and better with the years. He's also the author of one of my favorite essays called The Complexity of American Communism. Only Leo would write an essay called The Complexity of American Communism. It's a fantastic book, but he's not only a brilliant historian, he's also a hilarious historian. I've had him come to the Brookings Institution where I work, and everyone expects simply a serious historical analysis. And he does indeed do a serious historical analysis, but he does serious historical analysis as stand-up. And the entire room was rolling with laughter the entire time when he did a short talk on corruption through American history. It was really quite a wonderful talk. I want to begin today, as I almost always begin talks about religion and politics, which is the story of Mrs. O'Reilly. Many of you know her, if not personally, then by analogy. And I always like to tell this story because, you know, these days especially, there is this sense that religion lives only on the right. My Actually, my 7-year-old last week asked the question. I would ask all of you to think of an answer that I can give her. She looked at her mother and me and said, "Dad or Mom, is God a Democrat?" And there are a lot of people who answered in the negative last week, but not Mrs. O'Reilly. Mrs. O'Reilly was being taken to the polls by her son, as he did every election. And her son was, as she was, Catholic, and he had become rather well-to-do. And unlike his mother, who always voted straight Democratic, the son had started voting for a fair number of Republicans. And as he always did, even though he knew the answer, he asked her on the way to the polls how she was going to vote, and she said, as always, straight Democratic. And the son said, "You know, Mom, if Jesus came back to earth and ran as a Republican, you would vote against him." And Mrs. O'Reilly looked at her son and said, "Oh, hush. Why should he change his party after all these years?" Well, apparently a lot of Americans in this election, including a lot of Catholics, thought he finally changed his party. And that's what I would like to talk about today. I think one of the problems of talking about the Catholic vote is that the Catholic vote has meant very different things at different points in our history. It's also the case, I would argue, that there is no Catholic vote and it is important. And that those two things are true at the same time. And I was asked to talk about the relationship between this campaign and the John F. Kennedy's election, which I think is very important because, after all, John F. Kerry is the first Catholic to be nominated for the presidency since John Kennedy. Let's just look first at the raw numbers to look at the difference between these two elections. When John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he received, according to the Gallup poll, 78% of the Catholic vote. There are other estimates that put it around 80%. John Kerry did nothing like that. According to the exit polls, George Bush carried the Catholic vote over only the third major party Catholic nominee, Bush 52, Kerry 47. Now within that, there is an interesting finding. The Bush campaign paid a great deal of attention, as many of you know, to church-attending Catholics. They paid a great deal of attention to Catholics moved primarily by the issues of abortion, stem cell research, and gay marriage. And so they did make a major effort to focus on church-going Catholics, and they did gain an advantage among church-going Catholics, though I think that the numbers I'm about to read you are surprising, not because Bush carried the church-attending Catholics, but because the difference between churchgoers and non-regular churchgoers, it should be emphasized, was quite modest. Among Catholics who go to church weekly, Bush won, that's with the E-E-K-L-E-Y, Bush won 56% to 43%. But among Catholics who went to church less often, the margin was very thin. It was Kerry 50, Bush 49. So I think when you look at those numbers, whatever else was going on in this campaign, it's clearly the case that abortion and stem cells and those issues had an effect on the Catholic vote. But I think Catholics may have been moved by many of the same issues that moved the rest of the electorate, particularly terrorism. I also just want to assert, as a general point, that in looking at this election, it ought to be possible to hold two views in your head at the same time without being accused of being a flip-flopper. And the two views are that moral values mattered in this election, but they didn't matter nearly as much as the first week of commentary suggested they did. And I don't want to go into too much detail on that except to say a couple of things. First, all of those stories you read were based on a true finding in the exit polls, which is that the issue on those exit polls that people checked the most was the issue of moral values. It was 22% of Americans. But when you looked at the numbers, what that also meant is that 71% of Americans checked some issue other than moral values. 7% exercised their God-given right not to answer questions on a network exit poll. So that 71% compared to 22%. Moreover, if you combine certain categories in the poll, Iraq and terrorism, that cluster loomed larger than moral values. If you combine jobs, the economy, and healthcare, that cluster also loomed larger than moral values. The second thing is that on that question, Andy Kohut of the Pew Research Center, a friend and somebody whose work I admire very much, did a fascinating experiment after the election in which he took a sample of Americans and split them in half. And in the first half, he gave them the same list as was on the exit poll, including moral values. The second group of Americans, when he asked what was the most important issue in the election, he gave them no list at all. It was entirely their spontaneous answer. The first group that got the list, 27% said moral values, presumably because they had read all those stories in the newspapers that moral values were important, and nobody wants to think they voted on immoral values in the election. Anybody who did, I want to hear from in this conversation, because you were a very interesting voter. On the second list, the second time when people were given no list, only 9% actually spontaneously said moral values as their reason for voting. Another 3%, as I recall, said stem cell research or gay marriage or abortion. Another couple of percent said the moral values of the candidates. So even with all those put together, you only got 14% who said moral values. I think that's very important in analyzing the election in general, but also in thinking about how Catholics voted. Because yes, we do vote on a variety of moral values, but we also vote very practically, as many Catholic politicians have known for a very long time. It's possible to say, in other words, that the idea that moral values was the sole driver of this election, without saying that they did not play, either that they did not play an important role, or that the Democratic Party needs to pay more attention to framing their positions in terms of moral values. War and peace are life issues. Social justice is a moral issue. I heard a fascinating talk by Senator Bob Kerrey, the other Senator Kerrey, and he was at Fordham University, and on the podium, everybody had been given a Fordham University hat, and he looked inside, and the hat was made in North Vietnam. And Bob Kerrey got up and noted that the textile agreement, which has marginally protected parts of the American textile industry, even though most have gone overseas, is about to expire. And he asked the question, imagine a young woman who has recently lost her job in the textile industry. Imagine she had a particularly good, and unusually good, textile industry job that provided her as well with health insurance. And then imagine that she got pregnant. What choice is she more likely to make if she has a job with health insurance, and if she has no job without any health insurance to bring this baby into the world safely and in a healthy way, and then money to support the child? And Kerry's point was that people who care about the abortion issue and care about reducing the number of abortions need to think not only about what the law says, whether Roe v. Wade was right or wrong, but also the circumstances in which people make those life choices. And when I heard Kerry give that speech, I said, I want to tell every Democrat in the country to listen to what Bob Kerrey said, because it seems to me that that is a powerful moral frame on the basic issue of social justice that actually creates a link between the sort of traditional social justice views of many liberals and the right to life views that are associated with, though are not the exclusive province of, many conservatives. Let's look at this election. 44 years ago, John F. Kennedy became the nation's first Roman Catholic president by repeating over and over again that his faith would have no effect on how he would govern. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. a little mischievously once said that he indeed never saw an occasion in which he could see an organic link between John F. Kennedy's faith and the rest of his life. I think he said that at the time in defense of John F. Kennedy. Now, in this year, John Kerry faced resistance to his effort to become the nation's second Roman Catholic president because in the eyes of his Catholic critics, particularly among conservatives, church teaching did not have enough influence on his views in politics. It is ironic to think about it that John F. Kennedy lost votes among evangelical Christians because he was considered too Catholic. And I'm going to sort of quote some of what the evangelicals said back in 1960. In this election, John F. Kerry would have had a better shot of winning more of those evangelical votes if he had been seen as more Catholic by those very voters on issues such as stem cell research and abortion. What happened to John Kerry, I think, this year, what might be seen as a perfect storm. First, there was the frustration of many bishops and many rank-and-file Catholics who leaned Democratic on so many public issues over how hard it is for even mildly anti-abortion Democrats to gain traction or much respect within their party. Now, as for those of you who saw my column today, I think this is exaggerated to some degree. The Democrats today just elected Harry Reid as their leader in the Senate, who is opposed to abortion. They also elected David Bonnier, a rather strong foe of abortion, as their number 2 in the House. Nonetheless, in presidential elections, even mildly anti-abortion Democrats had trouble gaining traction. Second, there was, to put it charitably, a certain awkwardness, at least until the debates, in John Kerry's own approach to the questions related to the connection between his faith and his politics. His reference in early April of this year to a pope called Pius XXIII was not as specially helpful in courting the devout or the attentive. But what might be decisive was a third factor, an active campaign on the part of conservative Catholic Republicans to make abortion the one true litmus test for Catholic politicians. Or to be more precise about it, in a leaflet that appeared in the back of many churches, and many parish churches, including my own, by a group called Catholic Answers, there were really only 5 non-negotiable issues for Catholics in this election. The 5 being abortion, stem cell research, cloning, gay marriage, and which one am I leaving behind? Abortion. Well, that was connected to abortion. Euthanasia. Thank you. And you know, this conservative movement, which was actively supported by President Bush's re-election campaign, was quite pleased to make Kerry squirm over the question of whether he would be allowed to receive communion. The paradox was that the more closely the controversy was linked to the presidential campaign, the more reluctant at least some bishops became in singling out Kerry for this penalty of denying him Holy Communion. The Reverend Joseph Komacek, a great theology professor here, said, this was several months back, that the political reality is that it will be interpreted as favoring Bush over Kerry, this denial of communion. He said that the bishops were aware of the danger of a backlash, and indeed Father Joe Komacek's views ended up being very closely reflected by our Archbishop here in Washington, who spoke very explicitly about that danger of backlash. I just want to quote Father Komacek a little bit more, because I think what he said at the time was very insightful. He said, I don't myself think it is a good thing to use the Eucharist as an instrument of public disciplining. It is not a bad thing to have office holders and candidates reminded of certain duties and commitments that flow out of basic Christian convictions about human life, but this should obviously not be done solely with reference to a single issue such as abortion, but just as obviously, neither should any issue such as abortion be excluded as a matter of merely private choice. And I think it is important that Father McCarrick, Archbishop McCarrick here went out of his way to meet with John Kerry at the time to try to diffuse some of this controversy. This whole controversy over Holy Communion, can you imagine bishops back in 1960 threatening to deny John Kennedy Holy Communion in any way, except perhaps as a way to court more evangelical votes for Kennedy? And Peter Steinfeld of the New York Times talked about the sort of paradoxes of this sort of purity, of what he called moral purity in politics, when he talked about Senator Rick Santorum. As you know, a staunch foe of abortion, Senator Santorum campaigned hard for the now embattled Republican Senator Arlen Specter in a primary, even though Arlen Specter was a supporter of abortion rights and his challenger in the primary, Pat Toomey, was a staunch abortion foe. The question that Steinfels asked, which I think came out in the course of this campaign, is why is it acceptable for a committed Catholic abortion opponent, such as Santorum, to support Specter over an anti-abortion candidate, but not Kerry over Bush? And we can talk about this in the question period. Could Specter's party label just have had something to do with that choice? Now, why is it, I focus here on abortion because I think that we need to understand how different 2004 was from 1960. And the first, obviously, is the rise of new issues in our politics. Yes, Catholics had always been public foes of legal birth control. In my hometown of Fall River, in fact, I once spoke many years ago to a local party boss who talked with great fondness about the 1948 election. And he was very fond of the 1948 election because that was an election in which there was, and as he put it, Protestant Republicans put on the ballot a referendum to legalize birth control in Massachusetts. And in that election, Catholic priests all over the state of Massachusetts urged their flock to come out to vote against the legalization of birth control. And they produced, maybe Karl Rove studied this in this election, because they produced this extraordinary outpouring of Catholics at that moment, many of them first, second, third generation Americans. This party boss said gleefully, Catholics, the people who put that on the ballot didn't realize that once those people got in the polls, they were just going to vote straight Democratic. And indeed, it was one of the great Democratic sweeps in the state of Massachusetts in 1948 for Harry Truman, and it went all the way down the ticket. And in that case, this conservative social issue opposition to birth control was of great help to the party. But birth control, on balance, did not have the centrality in our politics that the abortion issue took after the Roe v. Wade decision, and that, of course, has been reinforced with the rise of the stem cell issue and also the issue of gay marriage. Now, the second thing that we simply have to confront is Catholic affluence. The great Milton Himmelfarb, who was a great conservative scholar of Jewish politics in the United States, once said that Jews have the wealth and status of Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. And I have always thought in that respect that Catholics would be more like Jews. But we are not. In fact, we are not quite like white Protestants, but neither are we like Jews. We're somewhere in the middle, closer to white Protestants. That if you look at polls over many elections, what you find is that Catholics are fairly consistently about 8 to 12 points more Democratic than white Protestants in comparable groups. But it still means that affluent white Protestants may be voting 80% for the Republicans. That means the Catholics are still voting 60, 65% for Republicans. Catholic affluence has certainly made a difference. It is also, and this effect was seen long before John Kennedy's election. If 2004 was peculiar, so was 1960. I think it's easy to forget that in the 1956 election, Dwight Eisenhower got roughly half of the Catholic vote. So that the trend of Catholics away from the party of Al Smith has been going on for a long time. It was interrupted in the 1960s by John Kennedy, but the pattern we saw in 2004 was not all that different from the pattern of 1956. But with another important exception, Catholic assimilation has happened to a different degree in different parts of the country. Catholics who live close to the areas of original immigration in the Northeast and Midwest are quite consistently more Democratic than Catholics who have moved to the South and the West. In the South, a substantial majority of Catholics, particularly white Catholics, vote Republican. In the West, they tend to vote very much like all of the other people around. And that is quite different, clearly, from the pattern of 1960, where all kinds of Catholics, no matter what they believed or where they lived, voted in overwhelming numbers for John F. Kennedy. I also think you have seen the breakdown of what you might call New Deal exceptionalism. And my friend and colleague Harold Meyerson, who writes a column for the Post, has a very powerful piece on this coming out in a forthcoming issue of the American Prospect, where he talks about the sensitivity of both the New Dealers and the leaders of the CIO, their sensitivity to the importance of Catholics in the working class and in the Democratic coalition. Now, on the one hand, there were some real conflicts within the CIO between Catholics and communists and allies of the communists. There were some very serious clashes. But nonetheless, Catholics were a very important part of the trade union movement. The CIO was very careful in avoiding taking any positions on issues such as birth control that might affect Catholic sensitivities. What Harold also ran across, and again, Karl Rove may have borrowed from this, or George Bush did, in some parts of the country, the New Deal permitted the flow of some of its relief programs to pass through Catholic churches. Again, there was a sense, there was a kind of pragmatic sense on the part of the New Deal that this sort of accommodation with Catholicism was important. And why not? Because some of the leading voices for New Dealism were within the Catholic Church. The Catholic Bishop's 1919 letter on social reconstruction has been seen by many, and not just Catholics, as the forerunner to a New Deal ideology. Monsignor John Ryan, the head of the National Catholic Welfare Conference, was also known as Father New Deal, and fairly so. This kind of organic link that existed in that moment, in that New Deal moment, does not exist to anything like the same degree now between Catholics and progressive causes and the Democrats. You see it in parts of the church. You see it particularly among nuns. A group of nuns right before the election sent me a wonderful button, which I meant to bring today. And the button had the fires of hell in the back. And it said Catholic Democrat. And in the middle it said, damned if you do, damned if you don't. But that is a rather different sensibility from the sensibility that existed back in 1960. So that while you do have some organic links between Catholic social action directors around the country, many nuns, many socially activist priests, and the progressive movement, it is not either as deep or as extensive within the hierarchy as it was back then. And again, and I don't think we can ever ignore it, back then there was not the abortion issue to muddy this otherwise seemingly natural alliance. At the end of this campaign, I have to say that I find myself sort of somewhat worried about the nature of sort of Catholic participation in politics. Worried, obviously, because I am of a particular point of view, and so if I'm totally honest about it, I wish some of those numbers had been flipped around. But also worried because I think that in this election, on both sides, on both the left and the right, there was a tendency to kind of ransack Catholic social thought to support a point of view that people had going into the election. C.S. Lewis once wrote about this when he said that people do not look at the words of Christ to figure out how they might vote. They look at the platform, they ransack the words of Christ to see which parts might support the point of view of their political party. And I think you saw, certainly on the Republican side, the effort to narrow the list of issues on which where there could be no compromise was clear. You could not read those leaflets. They didn't have to say vote Republican or vote for Bush. It was very clear that if those were the only 5 issues on which you voted, there was only one candidate who happened to subscribe to that list of issues. And you had some bishops, so by no means a majority of the bishops, writing encyclical letters to that effect as supporting that notion. And I don't think that the actual debate among Catholics was as publicly vigorous enough. Now, my friend John Parr down the street at the Catholic Conference argues that this is because the press did not give enough coverage to the other encyclical letters, which he is, or the other, not encyclical letters, but the other bishops' letters, which presented a more complicated view and said, yes, abortion is a life issue, but so is war and peace, and that social justice matters to Catholics. But I think we needed a much more public and robust debate than we had in this election. The good news is that there was another reason why there wasn't the kind of solidarity that existed back in 1960, and that is that anti-Catholic bigotry isn't what it used to be. And I think we should welcome that. The fact of anti-Catholic bigotry led many leaders of the church actually to play down the specificity of the Catholic faith. I quote here, excuse me, from a wonderful book by Thomas Meyer called The Kennedys, America's Emerald King. He is interested in the Irish and Catholic aspect of the Kennedys. This is Cardinal Cushing back in 1957. I don't think you can imagine a bishop saying these things. He said, I believe that people of all faiths think the same, that religion has nothing to do with a man's holding public office, the highest or the lowest. If John Kerry had said that in the debate, he would have been criticized for not making enough of his Catholic faith. Cardinal Cushing also said once, the only things Catholics agree on is the dogma mentioned in the Apostles' Creed. Again, that stands in very stark contrast to what we heard during this campaign. Cardinal Cushing, in saying he would do everything he could to elect John Kennedy, said, I would have done the same for a Jewish or Negro candidate as long as I could break through what was a sort of iron curtain. What was that iron curtain? Well, let me just quote a couple of things that were said about John F. Kennedy in the election of a Catholic. He said, this is one anti-Catholic writer, let the Romanists move out of America. This is not in 1850, this is in 1960. Let the Romanists move out of America. Did you see the coronation of Big John? He was referring to Pope John the 23rd. Let's hope we never see the coronation of Little John. How many Catholics came over on the Mayflower? Not one. The Constitution is a Protestant Constitution. And then he said, boasting, I am perfectly willing to admit I'm a bigot. That creates a certain amount of solidarity. And I just have one more. This was slightly more sophisticated. In various areas where they predominate, Catholics have seized control of the public schools, staffed them with nun teachers, that's N-U-N, wearing their church garb, and introduced the catechism and practices of their church. In defending, this came from a letter that Norman Vincent Peale supported, and he said that his group was engaged in, quotes, an intelligent approach to the religious issue on a high philosophical level. So that is the prejudice that John F. Kennedy was up against. So, as I say, in that sense, I think we all welcome that the decline of Catholic solidarity, because there is not a need to have the same kind of solidarity in the face of such bigotry. But as I said, I also worry about the nature of the debate within the Catholic Church. Now, I said at the beginning, there is no Catholic vote, and it's important. Catholics have been dividing on presidential elections pretty much since 1972. You had very strong Catholic vote for Kennedy, repeated for Lyndon Johnson, although interestingly, Catholics are about the only group where Johnson may have run a little bit behind where he was, Catholics and white Southerners. And then you had sort of a steady decline where Catholics became a 50-50 group for the reasons I said, some having to do with the ideology, some having to do with affluence and assimilation. My hope is that when Catholics look back on this election, we start thinking about what our specific role is in American politics. It strikes me that Catholics have an unusual opportunity to be a kind of ginger group in American politics, to make each party feel a little bit uncomfortable. But to do that, that requires not sort of saying that only certain issues matter to Catholics. I think it's a perfectly good thing for Catholics to make liberals ask questions about, feel uncomfortable with. I'm Catholic, so I have nothing against guilt. to feel a little uncomfortable on issues related to family, on issues related to abortion or stem cell research. I think there are some important questions to be asked about that. And on stem cell research in particular, the dangers, if you will, of a certain kind of industrialization of science. One of the most powerful speeches on this was given not by a Catholic, but by a socialist called Bernie Sanders, who is a member of Congress and worried about this aspect of the stem cell debate. But I also think that Catholics are missing their obligation if they do not make Republicans feel very uncomfortable about their positions on social justice issues, about the preference for tax cuts over aid to the poor. And I surely think also that there is a great Catholic tradition of argument about war as a last resort. When Kerry said that, by the way, it may have been the most Catholic thing he said in the presidential campaign, because the idea of war as a last resort is so deeply rooted in the social justice teaching of the Catholic Church. The days are gone when taking communion and pulling the democratic lever were the outward signs of what it took to be a good Catholic. The new partisan competition makes the Catholic vote more interesting. As a Catholic, I'd also like to think it could be useful, and that Catholics might challenge both parties. In this election, I think most of us went with our party and found some justification for that. I think we need to look into our consciences and ask, is there a better way for the Church to play its role now that the prejudices exhibited so starkly in 1960 have been put behind us? Thank you very much. Over here.
A very cruel taskmaster. E.J. Dionne's done a wonderful job of introducing the two commentators, John White from Catholic's Politics Department and Leo Rebuffo, who's from the History Department at George Washington. So I will simply remind you that John White studies the political process and the U.S. presidency, that he's written an important book called The Values Divide, which I think he would probably have reference to in his comments. Leo writes on the history, I guess, generally in 20th century American politics. He has a deep interest in American conservatism, and I agree with you, J.D.O., he's one of the funniest people I know.
We're building up, Leo.
I neglected to tell the commentators who would go first, but since the visiting team bats first, I think we should ask Professor Rebuffo to lead off.
EJ knows the only conspiracy theory I believe in is that lecterns are built for short people with good eyesight. I haven't either. So I will speak under this bright light. The presidential election in 1960 is not only closer in years to the election of 28 than in 2004, but also much closer, as EJ has made clear, in terms of the American scene, including the religious scene. A cynical Democrat, Richard Scammon, observed in that 1960 proved that a Catholic could be elected president if he was a millionaire war hero with a beautiful wife. Scammon should have added that such a fellow could win also if he ran at a time when there are relatively few religious issues on the national agenda. The question repeatedly asked of Kennedy was essentially the same one asked of Al Smith. Will you be a tool of the Pope? Both answered eloquently no, though Kennedy with greater wit. Yet the context and details are instructive. In 1928, a religion-related issue was central to national politics: prohibition. As silly as this may seem to Catholic youth students I sometimes see at Capitol Hill bars, it was as serious and wrenching for 100 years as abortion is now. And I sometimes think abortion may go away, and I sometimes think it will be like prohibition and go on forever. And the main fault line was between Protestant dries and Catholic wets, with a few politically shrewd moists. Like those are the terms, like Herbert Hoover trying to straddle. And this was all debated in the context of 27 million immigrants, new immigrants as they were then called, from the 80s to the 20s. Those Italians and Poles and Hungarians and Jews who were your forebears may seem normal, but take my word for it, they were just as alien to an overwhelmingly Protestant culture as Muslims are to most Americans now. By the 50s, the situation changed in important respects. The Depression had made the 20s cultural conflicts less pressing. They didn't disappear, but they were less pressing. The New Deal and World War II had fostered cultural tolerance and the assimilation of immigrant offspring. And the cross-denominational, not interdenominational, but cross-denominational religious revival begun during World War II was sufficiently bland to be ecumenical. A devout Catholic like Jesuit John Courtney Murray might grumble in 1959 that this fifth great awakening fostered religion in general, whatever that is. But the situation boded well for a pro forma Catholic billionaire with a millionaire wife, with a beautiful wife, and presidential ambitions. The religious comedy of the 50s should not, comedy, of the 50s should not be exaggerated. Indeed, though anti-Semitism steadily declined, I think a case could be made that relations between Protestants and Catholics declined after World War II. And there's a good book on Catholic history by John McGreevy, the Notre Dame McGreevy, not the Jersey McGreevy, that recovers the anti-Catholicism of the 50s. Catholics felt assertive, not least because their patriotism had been demonstrated in disproportionate military service and unrelenting anti-communism, something that could not be said of Protestant social gospel. So, Catholics at various levels and with various degrees of anger asked in the 50s why they were not white first-class citizens, and how could their parochial schools not receive federal aid. Cardinal Spellman of New York accused Eleanor Roosevelt to oppose such aid in displaying an anti-Catholic bigotry unworthy of an American mother. There's lots of this. Scholars really need to study this. Protestants, including many theological liberals, thought Catholics unduly assertive. They resented the Catholic notion that, as the comedian Lenny Bruce put it, theirs was the church. And the most famous Catholic pol before Kennedy was, of course, Joe McCarthy, who seemed to be to many liberal Protestants an heir to the Inquisition and a stereotypical Irish Catholic bully. And if you go to used bookstores, you find endless books by the highbrow nativist, though not a stupid guy, Paul Blanchard, who thought that both the Communist Party and the Catholic Church should register as alien entities under the Smith Act. So, it's not surprising that in 1959, 24% of Americans polled said they would not vote for a qualified Catholic. Nonetheless, religion-related issues, as E.J. emphasized, were marginal compared to the situation in the past 3 decades. Certainly there were gay Americans, certainly there were abortions, but these clearly were not discussed in the presidential campaign. So, Kennedy could argue with a more or less straight face the following. Since he thought the aid to parochial schools unconstitutional, since he would never name an ambassador to the Vatican except maybe the anti-Catholic Episcopal Bishop, Methodist Bishop Oxnam, and since he was not a legal subject of the Pope, there was no religious issue in the sense that the major candidates differ on the role of religion in our political life. In public, he even doubted the existence of the so-called Catholic vote, perhaps prefiguring E.J. here. The atmosphere surrounding all of this are what we remember. There's no religious test for my brother who died in World War II, or for me when my PT boat was run over, or at the Alamo. Bigotry embarrassed the country in the Cold War. How would Conrad Adenauer feel? How would Charles de Gaulle feel if they came here and discovered this is a country that couldn't have a Catholic president, and so forth? Yes, less remembered are points that Kennedy made in a terrific speech to newspaper editors during the West Virginia primary season, much more significant than the more famous Houston Protestant minister's speech. Journalists who had been harping on religious issues ignored more serious national questions, Kennedy asserted. And I can say the following because I don't consider E.J. a journalist, rather an intellectual who happens to write a column. I am glad that a president I admire has as dim a view of national political journalists as I do. Equally notable is a point that now sounds as archaic as Jeffersonian deism. The president is not elected to be protector of the faith or guardian of the public morals. His attendance at church on Sunday should be his business alone and not a showcase of the nation. In the general election, Nixon, through a combination of political shrewdness and residual Quaker decency, you can figure how they're weighed, did not even covertly encourage anti-Catholic bigotry as Hoover had done in 1928, but he privately grumbled that the Democrats were advertising a vote for Kennedy as a vote for tolerance, as they were indeed. By standard estimates, Kennedy lost about 1.5 million votes because he was a Catholic, but as E.J. pointed out, he received an overwhelming percentage of the non-existent so-called Catholic vote. Seems to be not Kennedy's election, but his assassination and the national mourning, which included a televised Latin Mass, ended the question of whether a Catholic could legitimately run for president. But of course, other factors contributed. Vatican II, we shouldn't exaggerate. We shouldn't miss how much the church indeed changed. And of course, the upheavals of the 60s. In 1968, hardly anyone cared that Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy were Catholics. And in the past 40 years, 3 vice presidential nominees were Catholics, William Miller, Edmund Muskie, and Geraldine Ferraro. And Catholic, more or less serious presidential contenders were commonplace. How many people know that Bruce Babbitt and Al Haig are Catholics? But no Catholic was nominated until 2004, when Kerry, a Catholic, probably more devout than JFK, lost the Catholic vote, as E.J. has observed. And he lost it to a highly visible evangelical Republican. Bush was not the first Republican to win the Catholic vote, as E.J. observed. Ike came close. Nixon was the first against McGovern in 72. Reagan similarly against Mondale in 84. But Republican win against the Catholic Democrat underscores how far we are from the religious and otherwise social scene of 1960. There's Catholic upward mobility, as E.J. has observed. As Catholics were less segregated from the mainstream, they moved sort of rightward, as the electorate moved sort of rightward. I think that's very complicated. If polls were better and people more honest, we would know how much race played a role in this trend. Suffice it to say that many Catholic Nixon Democrats and Reagan Democrats left the party of their parents because it became the party of busing and affirmative action. But the Democratic Party also became the party of what was widely perceived as wimpy foreign policy, though as an unreconstructed government. I don't look at it that way. As Nixon Democrats and Reagan Democrats departed, and that also included an enormous number of white Southern evangelicals, the Democratic Party became more secular and in ways more culturally tolerant. In one sense, this was hardly news. On the whole, the Democrats had been the more secular party since Jefferson. And the Republican Party, as its weak predecessor, had been the preeminent party of Protestant moralism. To put it differently, in the late 19th century, if you wanted to sing hymns around the White House piano drinking lemonade, Presidents Hayes, Harrison, and McKinley were happy to accommodate you. If you wanted a cold beer even on Sunday, you were probably a Democrat, and President Grover Cleveland was happy to belly up to the bar with you. But cultural issues change over time, as E.J. observes, and many descendants of Catholics who favored the eclectic and culturally tolerant among whites Democratic Party when it opposed prohibition were skeptical when that party opposed prayer in public schools and favored abortion and gay rights. As these cultural issues changed and grew more prominent, especially during the past 4 decades, Catholics and Protestant theological conservatives and regular churchgoers found that they had more in common with each other than with the theological liberals and pro forma believers in their own denominations. At first, the religious issue in 2004 seemed to focus only on President Bush, and in the end, I think, he did bear the brunt of the discussion. Although a few bishops thought Carey should be denied communion because he stood by Roe v. Wade and stem cell research, neither the Vatican nor the American Church pressed this point, probably sensing that to do so would not only quickly enlarge the membership of the Episcopal Church with ex-Catholics, but would also damage the political careers of all Catholics by raising the old specter of control from Rome. Meanwhile, frightened liberals and mainstream pundits regularly presented President Bush as a fundamentalist zealot unprecedented in presidential history. Among those doing so was your most famous journalistic alumna, Maureen Dowd. It is hard for me to emphasize how crazy this interpretation is. I have, however, written a scholarly paper on it if anybody wants it. But in the meantime, take my word for it. Take the word of this Kerry supporter and modest contributor. Bush is a moderately conservative evangelical, well within the tradition of American civil religion. Bush's religiosity won votes, which is hardly surprising. The United States is routinely described as the most religious country in the industrial world, which is sort of true in a complicated way. Moreover, as academics wallowing in deconstruction and postmodernism seem to have forgotten, people tend to vote for and hire and socialize men and women whom they perceive to be like themselves. In the wake of Carey's loss, Democrats are thrashing about once again, hoping to find a way that they can demonstrate their religiosity. I do not doubt the faith of theological liberals, but speaking as an unreconstructed, secular, humanist, non-practicing cultural Catholic, I don't think buzzwords about people of faith can obscure real differences of belief and the policy issues that follow from them. And certainly scholars should face up to these. EJ will probably say in rejoinder, since he is such a nice person, no irony intended, that we all would be well if we were nicer to each other. Doubtless so. Is this development likely? This has been one of our disagreements since we met more than a decade ago. As one of my favorite Hemingway heroes put it, isn't it pretty to think so?
Thank you, Leo. I will try to be brief because I know we want to get to questions. And thank my friend EJ for being here. We two go a long way back, and I don't disagree with anything that you say, but I know you to be a person of nuance, and so I will add my nuance.
That's an insult to your
point. No, it's not insulting at all. It means you're thoughtful.
You just have to be very good.
Right. The late Everett Ladd talked about the search for the axial principle of politics. Where do social change and political conflict meet? There's no question that when John Kennedy ran for president 40 years ago, religion was an important axial principle of American politics because there was, for one thing, a strong sense of Catholic identity. That identity formed by loyalty to a parish, by attendance at school, by the church being an important institution to accommodate new immigrants into American life. And yes, also an identity formed by prejudice, the Nina signs and the rest. Way back in 1952, I like polls, 83% of Catholics said their religion was very important to them. And interestingly, that same year, a plurality of all Americans said that Catholics try too hard to recruit others to their religious faith. That's the context in which John Kennedy was running for president in 1960, and that's the context by which he won 3/4 of the Catholic vote. And yet we know times have changed. We're as far away today from the New Deal as the New Deal was from the Civil War. So of course times have changed. And John Kennedy, I think, recognized this. The last political meeting that John Kennedy held at the White House was on November 13th, 1963. And at that meeting, he had a fellow there by the name of Richard Scanlon, who was then the director of the census. And the focus of that meeting was lots of Americans, including Catholics, are moving to the cities, to the suburbs. And as they move to the suburbs, they're becoming Republicans. Why? What is it? At what point do many of those urban emigres tip to the Republicans and perhaps indeed lose their sense of Catholic identity or are consumed by other issues like taxes? Scanlon promised he would research this and find out, and it's actually one of the great sad stories of American politics that just 9 days later Kennedy was assassinated, and the research, so far as I know, never happened, or if it did, it happened later with Scanlon's book, The Real Majority. Only twice since 1976 have Catholic Democrats, or Catholics won a majority, or Democrats, excuse me, twice from 1976 to 2004 have Democrats won a majority of the Catholic vote. That's 1976 and 1996. There certainly is a tremendous loss of a sense of Catholic identity. I'm from Rhode Island, as EJ knows. Way back in 1980, this most heavily Catholic state in the Union was represented in the U.S. Senate by Claiborne Pell and John Chafee, both non-Catholic. Pell once told me that if ethnicity and religion mattered, I wouldn't be here, quote unquote. But I also think that that loss of identity was really illustrated in 2000 when George W. Bush went to Bob Jones University, self-described the world's most unusual university. A description I would agree with. Bob Jones once likened the Pope to the biblical Antichrist. If you went to Bob Jones, or you were to visit Bob Jones, and you were to look for any books on American Catholicism, you would find them in the bookstore, but you have to look under the heading cults to find them. Interestingly, after that talk, William Donahue, who's the head of the Catholic League, denounced Bush's choice of a site, by which, of course, Bush was doing this in the context of trying to defeat McCain in the South Carolina primary, by saying, quote, he doesn't get it. But then just as quickly adding, I don't think he's a bigot. Imagine if this had taken place in 1960. And in fact, though Bush did not win the Catholic vote in 2000, he came pretty darn close to it. And Gore may have won simply because the composition of the Catholic vote, so-called Catholic vote, is changing fairly dramatically. Perhaps CJ and I have one brief moment of disagreement on the question of moral values in the exit polls and what this means. There's no doubt that lifestyle matters in American politics. And though you can debate the question of what is a moral issue, what I think is very clear is that we have a new axial principle now developing that transcends that old Protestant Catholic religious divide. And that axial principle is this question of values. And the real division, I think, in American politics is, do you like your morality writ large? Do you believe that there is an absolute sense of right and wrong in American life? Or do you like your morality writ small, meaning that my morality is for me but not necessarily for you? And it's clear that church attendance, regardless of denomination, is part of this new divide in American politics. And that has turned the discussions of 1960 and 2004 upside down, where, for example, Billy Graham's magazine Christianity Today editorialized in June of 2004 that they wished John F. Kerry would have been, quote unquote, a little bit more Catholic. And I think that that's a fascinating development in terms of where we are in American politics. One last point. I think one thing that's overlooked, by the way, speaking of John Kennedy, that helped him tremendously was his profound anti-communism, which also brought him into agreement with many Catholic voters in the country. It was one reason why a number of Catholics defected and voted for Dwight Eisenhower. As this new axial principle takes hold, that has values as its cutting edge, I think one of the effects, sadly, is that it makes our own politics, therefore, so much more divisive, not just within the Catholic Church in terms of obtaining the kinds of dialogues that we would want and that you called for, EJ, in your talk, but I think gets both groups talking apart from one another in our American politics. And the 2004 election really demonstrated that vividly, not just in the presidential contest, but the fact that now, as values become so important, the Southern distortion of American politics becomes, I think, even more prominent. And thus, the demints, if you will, the Tom Coburns, these are the newly elected senators from South Carolina and Oklahoma, couldn't get elected to the school board in Massachusetts or Connecticut, which used to be a swing state, or my state of Rhode Island. In other words, the divisions become so deeply ingrained now in American politics that it's hard, even within institutions and across institutions, to begin to have parallel conversations, I think, and find out what it is, in fact, that we do have in common. Americans always say they long for that commonality, but I think the nature of the division that is inherent now in American political life makes the new axial principle more ingrained and has led to this kind of turning of politics, at least 1960 style, upside down. A recent case of that upside down nature of politics involves the president of our own university. And think of a striking scene. Here he is on election night giving the benediction at the Bush-Cheney headquarters. This is something that would have been almost unthinkable in 1960. But I think it represents this kind of turning around of our politics on its head. Thank you.
Just a couple of quick things in history. I wanted to just say first that Neil Rebufo is such a great intellectual influence on me, and I'm not nearly as naive as I was when I first met him. Many of my conservative friends claim. The second, I want to underscore something that both John and Leo said, which is the fact that the denominational splits don't matter nearly as much as the political splits. And John Green at the University of Akron did this wonderful big study where he looked at religious groups and then divided them as traditionalists, centrists, and modernists. And centrist, I think, is only defined by answers between the traditionalists and the modernists. And clearly, the modernists and the centrists in almost all of these categories had more in common with each other than they did than the people within the groups. There were differences, but that was critical differences. The third point is, I think it's worth thinking about, as Leo suggested, that Catholics originally came to the Democratic Party because they were the party of openness and toleration. They were pro-immigrant and they weren't anti-booze. And when the moral issues changed from booze to other things, that had something to do with the change, and also the fact that Catholics became established. But I think the sort of vector of the Democratic Party is in some ways entirely different than it was. It was the tolerant conservative party. Now it's the tolerant liberal party. Third quick point on John Kennedy. The contrast in some ways is not with John Kerry, but with Joe Lieberman. And that when you think about the 2000 election, Joe Lieberman was a breakthrough candidate. And the first Jew nominated for public office, yet they dealt with their religion in entirely different ways. Now, some of that was simply authenticity on both parts. Joe Lieberman was more authentically religious than John Kennedy. I know authentic, I won't say more profoundly, but religion was more profound to Joe Lieberman than it was to John Kennedy. But secondly, it was said that by emphasizing his faith, Joe Lieberman was appealing to the very same religious evangelical Christians as John Kennedy was by de-emphasizing his faith. Because the issue, as John suggested in 2000, was how religious are you? And conservative Christians were more comfortable with somebody who was religious overtly religious, whereas in 1960 it was still an issue of Catholic versus Protestant. Last quick point. It really is important to note that the Catholic vote has often been divided in our history. Two folks I know did papers separated by about 25 years in when they were written. They came to the same conclusion: why New York Catholics were consistently 20 points more Republican than Massachusetts Catholics. And there were a lot of factors in there. One of them, the existence of the American Labor Party in New York, which was a left-of-center party that sometimes endorsed Democrats and sometimes didn't. And when the ALP would endorse the Democrats, they'd pick up the Jewish vote and lose the Catholic vote. And then when they split with the ALP, the Jewish vote would go over to the ALP, and they get the Catholics, and they still lose. And that's why you had a lot of Republican governors in the state that were solidly Democratic. And also the nature of conflict was different, because in Massachusetts, conflict was almost always Catholic Democrat versus Protestant Republican, whereas in New York it was more complicated. And the last point, just in deference to our New England background, it's also the case that there was a lot of deep ethnic conflict within the Catholic Church and within the Catholic tradition, so that my people, the French Canadians, were Republican until the New Deal, partly because the Irish didn't really want them in the party, and partly because the Yankees were desperate for new allies with high birth rates. So my dear cousin, great cousin, my father's cousin, Oscar U. Dion, died of a heart attack running on the Republican ticket for state treasurer in 1934. And he was typical of the French-Canadian political generation that was about to end, because I'm not sure the election results would have been kinder to him, because the New Deal converted all those groups into Democrats. But God bless Oscar.
We do have time for a few questions, so yes.
I was just wondering if you see any reason the Catholic Church focuses on issues such as abortion rather than social justice.
Well, some of it very much depends on which parts of the Catholic Church you're talking about. I mean, I gave a talk during the campaign to a group of people from Catholic Charities, and included a lot of social action directors. And I very much doubt there were very many Republican votes in that room. Some of them have real problems. I know some social justice Catholics who can't pull the Democratic lever because they feel so strongly, or now I guess you punch or draw a line, because they feel so strongly about the abortion issue, and that they just are frustrated with the Democratic Party's, as they see it, inability to come to their side. But that part of the church is very much concerned with the social justice issues. As recently as the mid-'80s, when you go back to the Catholic bishop's letter on the economy, it was essentially a social democratic document. It was a very left-of-center document. It was sufficiently left-of-center that a very intelligent group of conservative and neoconservative Catholics put out their own very extensive document to counter what they saw as a socialist letter from the bishops. I think what may have happened, some of this is generational change in the hierarchy. I think the John Paul bishops are, in a deep sense, more small c conservative than the earlier bishops. It doesn't mean that they don't care about social justice. Many of them, I suspect, were critical of the war in Iraq. But that I think for these bishops, the life issues are a higher priority, and they are more conservative. So I think some of this is a change in the leadership of the church. Because when you look at the rank and file, Catholic Democrats vote in part on issues that seem peculiarly Catholic, and that includes not only abortion and the like, but also there is a social justice component among Catholics. I mean, Catholic Republicans tend to give more social justice-oriented answers on polls than other kinds of Republicans do, so that the church teaching on social justice does influence, across the political divide. But a lot of Catholics are voting, Republican because they're for tax cuts, or Democratic because they're trade unionists. And so I do think, that's why I sort of say, I didn't realize John Kennedy said that, although he didn't believe it back then, that there is no Catholic vote, because I think these influences are there. But at least in my experience, there still are an awful lot of social justice Catholics out there. They're probably a little less, that emphasis is less represented in the hierarchy than it was 20 years ago.
I think that one of my huge issues about foreign policy is that, like North Korea thing, but they could probably practice market research. And also, over in this country, we have people get involved in church, or we have over this, like the Islamic theocracy in Iran, you know, those groups, what they do. You could motivate people on certain kinds of councils in the mosque and threaten have to influence public policy to help the Islamic revolution, you know, and help make the systems more bearable, even though we disagree with it. And that's something for policy, but also my view on when it comes to morality, but I'm for some morality, but not a whole lot. But I don't think that some ministers should ask the president of candidates, are you technically an adult? Because if you have any kind of criminal record or liability record, including you found liable, not afraid of contract and marriage, then that should come on. So you should assume because I might, the stories about me running for president having been an adult, I may not have done it. So the things that whether or not I doing some kind of normal thing, then I did violate the vow.
I think, before this gets too confessional, we should probably keep the questions fairly short and pointed.
Can I say two quick things in that in response to that? As far as I know, no minister or priest or nun or rabbi or imam has ever asked a candidate whether they committed adultery. Only the press has done that. No, I'll just leave it at that.
Our new imams. Yes, in the back row, please.
Yeah, all three of you made some reference to the issue of race. And I was wondering if you'd comment somewhat more in depth on that, because we talk about the red and blue states, but the real color line, it seems to me, in this country still is black and white. Bush won the white vote by 14 plus million. Kerry won the non-white vote by about 11 million. If you take away the 11 states of the Confederacy, Kerry actually wins both the Electoral College vote and the popular vote. So it seems to me that we still have a very deep racial divide, and I'd like to get your comments on that.
I think racial divide in this country is, at the moment, still considerably wider and more bitter than anything over religion. I hope that's not the case in 50 years. I hope that's not the case sooner. But I think that is certainly clear. And I would say this: that Catholic Republicans on the issue of race are better, from my view, more liberal than Protestant Republicans.
There's an old saying of Scammon and Wattenberg's, which is demography is destiny. And there is no question that the demographic makeup of the United States is changing rapidly. By 2050, whites will be a minority. Ethnic identification is part of that change in terms of what do ethnic Americans call themselves. We have, in some ways, perhaps a potential blurring of race. Tiger Woods calls himself a Cabalasian, which may be the term of the 21st century that we might want to think about. I think so I think you're right to call attention to this racial divide, and many Democrats will say that that should bode well for the Democratic Party. But we would have said the same thing about changing demography in 1904. That really what Democrats need is not just change demography, but also strong leadership and issues that bring all of that together. Demography may be destiny in 1904, but Democrats had to wait 28 more years, or whatever it was, 28 more years. I think Democrats are very much in that same boat now.
Could I just disagree on something that just drives me nuts? The notion that the United States will be a, quote, non-white nation in X number of years. We don't even know what the categories will be in 50 years. 70 years ago, it was common to refer to the Irish race, the Jewish race, then ethnic groups, then we all became a salad bowl. Who knows? It's related or mosaic now. It's up to later generations to define it, and I hope the harsh racial categories erode, as I suspect we all do.
I must say, on election night, I made the same observation about the effect of the old Confederacy on the election, and it did cross my mind, why not let our brothers separate peacefully? I confess to that. Just on race, briefly, you're clearly right on, Kerry, the white vote went 58-41, African Americans 88-11, and Latinos, these numbers are still in dispute, but 53-44 for Kerry, so there clearly is a divide. And I don't think there's any question that, as Leo suggested, that there was a kind of, backlash is a much debated term, but whatever term you want to use, around busing and racial integration in some of the big cities, there was the vote went to the Republicans because of those issues. I think the best book I've read on this is a book called by a guy called Jonathan Ryder, who is Jonathan at Yale, I think he's at Yale now, which is subtitled "The Jews and Italians of This is a piece of us. Now, you can argue, as I did actually in my undergraduate thesis, that some of this was about competition for resources. There was a real competition going on at the grassroots level between white ethnic Catholics and African Americans and so on. But it's a piece of us, and it is part of this movement that happened in the Nixon years.
Yeah.
Clearer picture of what John was saying about the axial principle. In 1979-80, the last session before the Reagan years, you couldn't predict abortion votes on the basis of party, but you could predict it on the basis of being Catholic. The majority of Catholics in both the House and Senate were pro-life. Of the evangelicals into the dominant Republican Party, making it a part of their party platform, and that being embraced by Reagan, that has changed things. Today, the majority of Catholic Democrats are pro-choice, and overwhelming majority of Catholic Republicans are pro-life. What makes it interesting is if you look at mainline Protestants, the House now is 40%, the Democrats in the House now are comprised of 40% Catholics, 22% blacks, 6% Jews, and the remainder are Protestants, or other. Protestants become a small minority of the Democratic majority of the Republican House.
So we mean white Protestants.
White Protestants.
That's a great observation. Just in terms of Congress, and this underscores the whole point of the new religious divides. In 1980, Don Nichols was elected senator from Oklahoma, a state which was one of the most evangelical states, a state that had a lot of anti-Catholic. Alabama, elected by evangelicals. So I think there is something to that. On the mainliners, I mean, you used to have the two swing groups in American politics religiously right now are, by and large, Roman Catholics and mainline Protestants, because the Catholics are less democratic than they used to be, and the mainline Protestants are less Republican than they used to be.
I think we have time for one more question.
Have been denied the Eucharist at Roman Catholic Church. Would there have been unintended consequences? And also, what role do you think Catholics played in the defeat?
On the second, I want to know more about South Dakota before I answer it. I think there was, Daschle had some I suppose you could say this is Trace critics would say, I am like John Kerry in this. I used to believe one thing and then I believed another. At first, I believed that it would probably hurt him because it would have a negative influence for the Catholic vote. And I came around thinking, holy. The numbers were, there were two polls done around the same time, and it was, as I recall, 73% against, 21% for denying him communion. 21% is below the base Republican vote.
To join me in thanking Don. Especially the wounded EJDM.